The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain, but Marcus Williams stood steady as granite. Behind him, 23 floors of glass and steel rose into the Atlanta sky, the headquarters of Pinnacle Financial, where he'd worked for 7 years, where they'd tried to break him, where they'd underestimated the quiet man who kept meticulous records, the man who just walked out of that courthouse with a 7-figure settlement and something far more valuable than money: vindication. The executives who'd tormented him, who'd whispered he'd never have the courage to fight back, who'd bet their careers on his silence, were about to learn what happens when good people finally stop being quiet. But how did a mild-mannered financial analyst from Stone Mountain bring one of Atlanta's most powerful corporations to its knees? What did Marcus Williams do that changed not just his life, but sent shockwaves through corporate America? And why did it take 7 years of systematic humiliation before he finally said enough? Marcus Williams was the kind of man who made Sunday morning at Ebenezer Baptist Church feel complete. His baritone voice carried amazing grace with a depth that made elderly women dab their eyes with handkerchiefs. He was 42, with graying temples that his wife Denise said made him look distinguished, though Marcus just saw them as proof that raising 3 teenagers could age a man faster than any job. Their home in Stone Mountain sat on a quiet street lined with Bradford pear trees, where neighbors still waved from front porches and children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. Every morning at 6:15, Marcus would sit at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that Denise made just strong enough to wake the dead, reviewing financial reports while the house slowly stirred to life. Jasmine, their eldest at 17, would thunder down the stairs like a Category 5 hurricane, grabbing a piece of toast and her AP chemistry textbook in one fluid motion. The twins, Michael and Michelle, 15, and mirror images of each other's stubbornness, would argue about everything from who stole whose phone charger to whether Atlanta United had any chance at the playoffs this year. This was Marcus's anchor, the steady rhythm of a family that functioned like a well-tuned orchestra, each member playing their part in perfect harmony. At Pinnacle Financial, Marcus had built his reputation one meticulously accurate report at a time. He was the senior financial analyst who never missed a deadline, never made an error, and never complained when the overtime stretched past midnight. His cubicle sat in the northeast corner of the 15th floor, decorated with a small photo of his family, a world's greatest dad mug that Michael had given him for Father's Day, and a small wooden cross that his grandmother had carved by hand. His colleagues respected his work ethic. His supervisors relied on his precision, and everyone knew that when Marcus Williams put his name on a financial projection, you could take it to the bank. The company's annual Juneteenth celebration was always held in the sleek conference room on the 20th floor, with catered soul food from a local restaurant and speeches about diversity and inclusion that sounded impressive on paper. Marcus had helped organize it for 3 years running, quietly ensuring that the event honored the history while bringing colleagues together. He took pride in those small moments when the office felt like community, when Janet from HR shared stories about her grandmother's freedom papers, or when David from marketing admitted he'd never understood the significance of the holiday until working at Pinnacle. These were the threads that made Marcus believe in the possibility of progress, in the idea that corporate America could evolve beyond its past. But even in those optimistic moments, Marcus noticed things. The way conversation shifted when he approached, the fact that in 7 years he'd never been invited to the executive golf outings that everyone whispered about on Monday mornings, the subtle surprise in clients' voices when they met him in person after months of phone conversations, the way his ideas in meetings were often credited to others, as if his voice had somehow failed to carry across the conference table. These weren't the dramatic confrontations that made headlines. They were paper cuts, small and sharp, accumulating over time until they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Denise had noticed, too. She was the kind of woman who could read people like open books, a skill honed during my 15 years as a middle school principal, where survival depended on detecting trouble before it erupted. "Something's bothering you," she said one evening as they sat on their back deck, watching fireflies dance between the magnolia trees. "You've got that look you get when you're chewing on something that won't go down easy." Marcus deflected then, talking about quarterly reports and budget projections. But Denise's eyes held the kind of knowing concern that only comes from 2 decades of marriage. She didn't push, but she watched, and she waited, because she knew her husband better than he knew himself sometimes. The first crack in Marcus's carefully constructed professional world came on a Tuesday morning in March, when Regional Vice President Bradley Hutchinson strut into the bullpen area like he owned not just the building, but everyone in it. Hutchinson was old Atlanta money wrapped in $1,000 suits, with the kind of confident swagger that came from never having to wonder if he belonged anywhere. He'd been at Pinnacle for 15 years, climbing the ladder with the efficiency of someone who never encountered a rung that wouldn't hold his weight. His corner office overlooked Piedmont Park, and his secretary guarded his schedule like state secrets. "Williams?" Hutchinson called out, loud enough for half the floor to hear. "I need those Henderson projections on my desk by noon, and they better be clean. I don't have time to fix slocky work." The dismissive tone cut through the morning chatter like a blade, and Marcus felt 20 pairs of eyes turned towards his cubicle. The Henderson projections were due at the end of the week. Marcus had confirmed this in writing just 2 days earlier. But he nodded anyway, swallowing the words that wanted to escape, and began the frantic scramble to compress 3 days of careful analysis into 3 hours of rushed calculations. That afternoon, Hutchinson's assistant, Meredith, a sweet woman in her 50s who'd worked at Pinnacle longer than anyone could remember, quietly slipped a note onto Marcus's desk. He knew the deadline was Friday, she had written in her careful script. "I heard him talking to Mr. Peterson about keeping Williams on his toes." The note disappeared into Marcus's desk drawer, filed away with the kind of precision that had made him such an effective analyst. He didn't know then that this was the first piece of evidence in a collection that would eventually fill 3 thick binders and change everything. It was like looking at the career of a stranger, someone incompetent and unreliable, someone who didn't deserve to work at a prestigious firm like Pinnacle Financial. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. "My last review was excellent. Mr. Peterson said—" Hutchinson's hand came down on the table with a sound like a gunshot. "Peterson isn't your supervisor anymore. I am. And what I'm seeing is a pattern of declining performance that needs immediate correction. You're on probation, effective immediately, 60 days to turn this around, or we'll be having a different conversation." The folder contained 90 days of documentation that read like fiction, a carefully constructed narrative of professional failure that bore no resemblance to Marcus's actual work. But it was official, stamped and signed, entered into his permanent file with the weight of corporate authority behind it. As Marcus walked back to his cubicle, he felt the eyes of his colleagues tracking his movement, and he wondered how much they'd heard through the thin conference room walls. Marcus Williams, who had walked into that meeting, was a respected senior analyst with an impeccable record. The one who walked out was damaged goods, marked for elimination. That evening, Marcus sat in his car in the Pinnacle parking garage for 20 minutes before starting the engine. The concrete walls seemed to press closer with each breath, and the familiar weight of his briefcase felt like an anchor dragging him toward the bottom of a deep, dark lake. For 7 years, this building had been his second home, the place where his skills were valued and his contributions mattered. Now it felt like hostile territory. Every corridor, a potential ambush. Every meeting, a possible trap. At home, Denise took one look at his face and sent the twins to their rooms with homework assignments that would keep them busy for hours. She poured 2 glasses of sweet tea, led Marcus to the back porch, and waited with the infinite patience of a woman who knew that some stories took time to tell. When he finally found the words, they came out like water through a broken dam. The impossible deadlines, the manufactured errors, the performance review that read like a work of creative fiction. Denise listened without interruption, her principal's mind cataloging details and connections that Marcus was too close to see. "Baby," she said when he finished, her voice carrying the steel that made middle schoolers straighten up in her presence. "This isn't about your work. This is about you." The words hung in the humid evening air like a challenge, and Marcus felt something shift inside him, a recognition that had been building for months, but that he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. This wasn't professional development. This wasn't rigorous management. This was something else entirely. Something older and more familiar, dressed up in corporate clothing and hidden behind HR policies. The next morning, Marcus did something he'd never done in 7 years at Pinnacle. He started documenting everything. Every interaction with Hutchinson went into a small notebook he kept in his desk drawer. Every email was printed and filed. Every witness to the mounting harassment was quietly noted. He began to see patterns in the madness, connections between seemingly random demands and impossible deadlines. What had felt like personal inadequacy began to look like systematic targeting, a campaign designed not to improve his performance, but to justify his eventual dismissal. Jennifer Chen became an unlikely ally, slipping him copies of company policies that Hutchinson seemed to be violating with impunity. "There are rules about performance improvement plans," she whispered during a brief conversation by the coffee machine. "They're supposed to provide support, not set you up to fail. What he's doing isn't just wrong, it's against company policy." She gave him the name of an employment attorney, scribbled on a small piece of paper that Marcus tucked into his wallet like a lifeline. The harassment escalated with the precision of a military campaign. Hutchinson began calling Marcus into his office for daily check-ins that felt more like interrogations, questioning every decision, every calculation, every word choice in his reports. He started reassigning Marcus's projects to other analysts, then criticizing him for having insufficient workload. When Marcus volunteered for overtime assignments, Hutchinson questioned his motives. When he left at normal hours, he was accused of lacking commitment. It was a maze with no exit, a game where the rules changed every time Marcus thought he understood them. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in August during the weekly staff meeting that all analysts were required to attend. The conference room was packed with 25 of Marcus's colleagues, people he'd worked alongside for years, people who knew the quality of his work and the strength of his character. Hutchinson stood at the head of the table, his suit pressed to perfection, his confidence radiating through the room like heat from a furnace. He was reviewing the quarterly performance metrics, highlighting successes and areas for improvement, when his eyes locked onto Marcus with predatory focus. "Before we adjourn," he said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I want to address something that affects all of us: professional standards. The expectation that everyone in this room pulls their weight and contributes to our collective success." The room grew quiet, that particular silence that descends when people sense that someone is about to be thrown to the wolves. Unfortunately, not everyone has been meeting those standards. Some people seem to think that showing up is enough, that years of service excuse current inadequacy. Marcus felt his face grow hot when 24 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Hutchinson didn't need to use his name. Everyone in the room understood who was being discussed. The attack was surgical in its precision, designed to humiliate without crossing legal lines, to destroy reputation while maintaining plausible deniability. Marcus's hands clenched under the table as Hutchinson continued, listing anonymous performance issues that everyone knew belonged to the quiet man in the corner, the one who'd never caused trouble, never fought back, never made waves. "I want everyone to understand," Hutchinson concluded, "that mediocrity has no place at Pinnacle Financial. We're building something exceptional here, and that requires exceptional people. Those who can't keep up might want to consider whether they're in the right place. The meeting ended with the usual discussions of quarterly bonuses and upcoming projects, but Marcus heard none of it. He sat frozen in his chair, feeling the weight of professional assassination settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The colleagues who'd once respected him now avoided eye contact, as if his presumed inadequacy might be contagious. That evening, Marcus sat in his home office, a converted spare bedroom, where he'd spent countless hours helping his children with homework and reviewing financial reports, and stared at the business card Jennifer had given him weeks earlier. Franklin Moore, employment attorney, read it in simple black letters. Marcus had carried it in his wallet for 2 months, taking it out occasionally like a talisman, but never quite finding the courage to dial the number. Now, with his career hanging by a thread and his reputation in tatters, the card felt like his only lifeline. The conversation with Franklin Moore lasted 2 hours and changed everything. Moore was a small man with a big voice, someone who'd spent 20 years fighting corporate giants on behalf of employees who thought they had no chance. He listened to Marcus's story with the focused attention of a surgeon examining a patient, asking pointed questions about dates, witnesses, and documentation. When Marcus produced the 3 binders of evidence he'd collected, the impossible deadlines, the contradictory demands, the performance reviews that defied reality, Moore's eyes lit up with the intensity of someone who just found buried treasure.
Mr. Williams, Moore said, leaning back in his leather chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd seen this story before. You've just described a textbook case of workplace harassment designed to force termination. The legal term is constructive dismissal, and what makes your case special is the documentation. Most people in your situation don't think about keeping records. You've built a fortress of evidence that would make any corporate lawyer nervous. For the first time in months, Marcus felt something like hope stirring in his chest. The isolated incidents that had felt like random cruelty began to form a pattern, a deliberate strategy that had legal names and established remedies. Moore explained the process with the patience of someone who'd guided many clients through similar battles. First, they would file a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, documenting the harassment and requesting an investigation. Then, if Pinnacle failed to correct the situation, they would pursue legal action in federal court. Companies like Pinnacle settle these cases quietly, Moore said, because they can afford the publicity. But that's only if they take us seriously, and they won't take us seriously unless they know you're prepared to fight. The word fight hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt something awakening in his chest that had been dormant for too long. The EEOC complaint was filed on a Tuesday morning in September. 43 pages of detailed allegations supported by nearly 200 pieces of evidence. Moore had crafted it with the precision of a legal surgeon, each charge supported by specific examples, each claim backed by documentation that Pinnacle's lawyers couldn't dismiss. The complaint painted a picture of systematic harassment designed to force the resignation of a respected employee, a campaign of professional assassination that violated both federal law and basic human decency. Pinnacle's response was swift and predictable. Within a week, Marcus was called into human resources for a meeting with Sarah Chen, no relation to Jennifer, and 2 lawyers who'd flown in from the company's corporate headquarters. The conference room felt like a tribunal, with Marcus sitting alone on one side of the table while 3 professionals in expensive suits arrayed themselves like a firing squad. They had their own documentation, they explained. Evidence of performance issues, concerns about attitude, questions about commitment that predated any harassment claims. Mr. Williams, Sarah Chen said in the tone of someone delivering disappointing news to a child, we take all employee concerns seriously, which is why we've conducted a thorough investigation of your allegations. Unfortunately, our findings don't support your claims. What we've discovered is a pattern of performance issues that your supervisor has been trying to address through standard management techniques.
If you're feeling overwhelmed by professional expectations, we have resources available to help you succeed." The lawyers nodded in practiced synchronization, their faces conveying the kind of sympathetic concern that comes standard in corporate crisis management training. They had counter-narratives for every piece of evidence Marcus had collected, alternative explanations that painted Hutchinson as a demanding but fair supervisor dealing with an underperforming employee. It was a master class in institutional gaslighting designed to make Marcus doubt his own perceptions and abandon his legal claims before they could gain traction. But something had changed in Marcus Williams during those months of documentation and legal consultation. The quiet man who'd always sought to avoid conflict, who'd built his career on steady competence and respectful collaboration, had been replaced by someone harder and more determined. He listened to their explanations with the patient attention of someone cataloging evidence, and when they finished their presentation, he asked for copies of every document they'd referenced. Their confident expressions flickered slightly at his calm response, as if they had expected anger or capitulation, but got something more dangerous instead: methodical preparation for battle. The EEOC ruling came on a Thursday afternoon in May, delivered by certified mail to both Marcus's home address and Franklin Moore's law office. The commission had found probable cause to believe that Pinnacle Financial had engaged in unlawful employment practices based on race, creating a hostile work environment and subjecting Marcus Williams to disparate treatment that violated federal civil rights law. The ruling authorized Marcus to pursue his claims in federal court and invited both parties to attempt resolution through mediation. Moore called Marcus at home that evening, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who just won the first round of a heavyweight fight. He said, "They're going to want to settle." Companies like Pinnacle don't want discrimination cases in federal court, especially with documentation this solid. The question is whether you want to take their money and disappear quietly, or whether you want to make them acknowledge what they did. The choice hung in the air between them, and Marcus thought about all the quiet moments when he'd swallowed his dignity, all the times he'd chosen silence over confrontation, all the years he'd believed that good work and respectful behavior would be enough to protect him. The mediation was scheduled on a Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta, in a conference room that overlooked the city Marcus had called home for his entire adult life. Pinnacle arrived with a team of 5 lawyers and executives, including Hutchinson himself, looking confident and prepared for a routine settlement negotiation. Marcus arrived with Franklin Moore and 3 binders of evidence that had grown even thicker during the months of legal preparation. The mediator, a retired federal judge named Patricia Hawkins, took one look at the assembled forces and understood that this wasn't going to be a simple conversation about money. Pinnacle's opening offer was insulting: 6 months' salary and a neutral reference letter in exchange for Marcus's silence and resignation. They presented it as a generous resolution to what they characterized as a misunderstanding between a demanding supervisor and a sensitive employee. Their lead attorney, a silver-haired man who radiated expensive education and corporate arrogance, explained that the company was offering this settlement as a gesture of goodwill, despite having done nothing wrong. The subtext was clear: take the money and disappear, or spend years in litigation with no guarantee of success. Moore's response was surgical in its precision. He opened the first binder and began walking through Marcus's evidence, piece by piece, document by document, building a narrative of systematic harassment that made the mediator's eyebrows rise progressively higher. The impossible deadlines, the manufactured performance issues, the public humiliation designed to force resignation. All of it laid out with the methodical precision that had made Marcus such an effective analyst. By the time Moore finished his presentation, the confidence had drained from Pinnacle's legal team like air from a punctured balloon. The negotiations continued for 6 hours with breaks for private consultations and hushed conversations between corporate executives and their lawyers.
Marcus watched it all with the calm attention of someone who'd already won the most important victory, the knowledge that he'd been right, that his perceptions hadn't been skewed by paranoia or oversensitivity, that the systematic cruelty he had endured had been real and deliberate and illegal. Every increased offer from Pinnacle was validation. Every worried glance between their lawyers was confirmation that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. The final settlement was more than money, it was acknowledgement. Pinnacle agreed to pay Marcus Williams $1.7 million in damages and lost wages. They agreed to provide sensitivity training for all supervisors with particular focus on preventing harassment and discrimination. They agreed to revise their performance evaluation procedures to prevent the kind of manufactured documentation that nearly destroyed Marcus's career.
But the victory that mattered most came in a moment that no lawyer could have negotiated. As the mediation concluded and documents were signed, Bradley Hutchinson approached Marcus in the hallway outside the conference room. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like shame. I want you to know, he said quietly, that this wasn't personal. Marcus looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who'd learned to see clearly through corporate smoke and mirrors. Mr. Hutchinson, he replied, everything you did to me was personal. The difference is, now everyone knows it. The settlement was finalized on a Friday afternoon, almost exactly 2 years after that first impossible deadline had begun Marcus's journey from victim to victor. He cleaned out his desk at Pinnacle for the last time, packing the few personal items that had decorated his cubicle for 7 years, the family photo, the world's greatest dad mug, and the wooden cross his grandmother had carved. His colleagues gathered around with awkward congratulations and quiet apologies, understanding finally what they'd witnessed but been too afraid to acknowledge. Jennifer Chen was the last to say goodbye, pressing a small wrapped package into Marcus's hands as he headed toward the elevator. Inside was a coffee mug with a simple message: "The truth will set you free." The accompanying note read, "Thank you for showing us what courage looks like. Your fight made all of us safer." As the elevator doors closed on 15 floors of corporate ambition and institutional indifference, Marcus realized that his victory belonged to more than just himself. It belonged to every employee who'd ever been made to feel small, every worker who'd ever been told their perceptions were wrong, every person who had ever wondered if standing up was worth the cost. The drive home took Marcus through neighborhoods he'd known his entire life, past the church where he'd sung in the choir, past the school where Denise had shaped young minds, past the park where he'd taught his children to ride bicycles and throw baseballs. Atlanta spread around him like a promise fulfilled, a city that had grown and changed and evolved, just as he had. The man driving home that evening was not the same one who'd arrived at Pinnacle 7 years earlier, full of hope and quiet determination to succeed through hard work and respectful behavior. This Marcus Williams had learned that sometimes survival requires more than competence. Sometimes it demands the courage to fight back. At home, the celebration was exactly what Marcus had expected. Subdued and meaningful, focused on family rather than money. Denise had prepared his favorite meal, and the children had made a banner that read, "Welcome home, Dad," in letters that got progressively smaller as they ran out of room. Over dinner, they talked about the future, about the college funds that were now fully secured, about the family vacation they'd always talked about taking, about the small consulting business Marcus was considering starting. But mostly, they talked about the present, about being together, about the quiet satisfaction of knowing that doing the right thing had finally led to the right result. Later that evening, as Marcus sat on his back porch watching fireflies dance between the magnolia trees, Denise joined him with 2 glasses of sweet tea and the comfortable silence of 20 years of marriage. "I'm proud of you," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of all the difficult conversations and sleepless nights and moments of doubt they'd shared. "Not for the money, not for winning. I'm proud of you for not letting them make you smaller than you are." The words settled over Marcus like a benediction, validation that the cost of fighting had been worth paying.
The Marcus Williams who'd filed that EEOC complaint 18 months earlier had been motivated primarily by survival, the need to preserve his career and protect his family's financial security. But the man sitting on his porch that evening understood that his victory belonged to a larger story, one that stretched back generations and forward into a future where other employees might face similar choices. His decision to document rather than endure, to fight rather than flee, had created precedent that would outlast the settlement check and the newspaper coverage and the temporary satisfaction of justice served. In the months that followed, Marcus discovered that his story had traveled farther than he'd imagined. Employment attorneys across the Southeast began using his case as a template for similar litigation. Corporate diversity officers cited his experience in training sessions designed to prevent harassment and discrimination. HR professionals studied his documentation methods to better understand how institutional bias manifested in performance evaluations and workplace interactions. The quiet analyst who just wanted to do good work and provide for his family had become an unlikely catalyst for change in corporate America. But perhaps the most important impact was the one that couldn't be measured in dollars or policy changes or legal precedents. Marcus Williams had proven to himself and others that silence, while sometimes necessary for survival, was not the only option available to those who faced systematic injustice. His decision to speak up, to document carefully, and to fight strategically had transformed not just his own circumstances, but the environment for everyone who came after him. The man they thought would stay silent forever had found his voice, and in finding it, had helped others find theirs as well. The settlement money provided financial security, but the real victory was simpler and more profound. Marcus Williams had refused to be diminished by those who tried to make him smaller. He'd stood up when standing up seemed impossible, spoken truth when truth seemed dangerous, and fought back when fighting back appeared hopeless. In doing so, he'd reclaimed not just his career and his dignity, but his faith in the possibility that justice, however delayed, could still be achieved by those brave enough to demand it. The story of Marcus Williams reminds us that institutional change begins with individual courage, that systematic injustice can only survive in environments where good people choose silence over action. His victory at Pinnacle Financial was more than personal vindication. It was proof that even the most entrenched forms of discrimination can be challenged and defeated when victims refuse to accept that their mistreatment is normal, inevitable, or deserved. In a world where corporate power often seems insurmountable and individual employees appear helpless against institutional bias, Marcus Williams demonstrated that careful documentation, strategic thinking, and persistent determination can level even the most uneven playing fields. How many Marcus Williams stories never get told because the victims lack the resources to fight back, or the support systems to sustain them through years of legal battle, or simply the knowledge that their experiences constitute illegal discrimination rather than normal workplace difficulties? How many talented employees are driven from their careers not by inadequate performance, but by systematic harassment designed to force their resignation? And how many companies continue these practices because they assume their victims will choose silence over the uncertainty and expense of legal confrontation? Marcus Williams proved that these assumptions can be wrong, that silence is not inevitable, and that justice, while never guaranteed, is always possible for those willing to demand it.